Hi, and welcome to Teacup Philosophy. Today we're going to get into our first debate. Now, this one I've picked because has been the most popular debate. And I've spoke for hours about this with friends, family, people online, and I find it really interesting to really pick apart and think about. And there's some subjective things in this as to why I find it interesting, and I'll go through some of that in a moment. But I also want to really bring it into a lighter way of looking at what happens outside of our existence on Earth as a human has something in physical form. So, today's podcast and debate is called Is There Life After Death? So, here we go. Okay, so again, don't worry, this isn't going to be a heavy one. There's going to be no cloaks and cryptic clues. It's just a few mind bending ideas from a few famous philosophers and maybe some things that I've read about and understood from a subjective point of view. And that's not to put my opinion on it, it's just to give some ideas and thoughts for further discussion. So, okay, so people have been asking this question for literally thousands and thousands of years, and it's from like ancient tombs in Egypt to more modern day near death experience that you might see on social media, such as TikTok or YouTube. We're all sort of obsessed with what happens after we die. Now, philosophy, or philosophically, should I say, this question belongs to metaphysics. So, if you listen to the other podcast or you're familiar with philosophy, this would mean the study of reality and existence and all that mysterious stuff that can't quite be seen or measured scientifically. So, the afterlife. Today, we're going to explore a few big ideas from both sides of the fence. So, the believers and the skeptics, and those awkwardly sitting in the middle, sipping tea and refusing to commit on any belief. So that's sort of like the background. So let's get into the nitty gritty of it. So we're going to look at arguments for life after death. Now, before we go into this, I'm just going to give you something subjective, so something about my experiences. I've been quite interested in this whole philosophy of life after death and if we exist after death, if we are one form or if we're mind, body, soul. I've been always been fascinated with this, and the reason for this is because I've had some experiences that I've not been able to explain. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. And I could talk about this all day and, try and debunk it and think of theories of why it might exist and why not. But in my experiences, so my first one, I suppose, was. Let's try and think back to this actually, because there's been quite a few. But when I was younger, I used to have dreams of things that, would happen. And so I'd have a dream, and then soon after these things that happen. Now, this could be down to coincidence or deja vu or whatever you might think. But for me, as a child, I always thought that I could sense things before they happened. And as I grew older and older, there was a lot of other weird stuff and weird coincidental stuff. The, when I got to 14, I experienced something with a friend. So it wasn't just me, this was somebody else. And again, I'm not convincing you to believe this. I've thought of different ways in um, how this could be scientific, or how this could be something that is psychologically transpiring because of thoughts and things happening around me, or things that not even, I've not even really looked at to debunk enough. But when I was 14, I was with my friend. We was boy racing at the time with a couple of older boys. So he was in the back of a car, and we parked up in the field in the middle of nowhere. And there was no fences around. It was a field. It was completely empty, apart from some trees that was like hundreds of yards away. So it was literally in the middle of this field. And we looked up and we saw, and no word of a lie, we saw two monks looking through a window, and at the car window. And we both screamed and put our heads down and then put our heads back up, and they'd disappeared. Now, we looked around the car, under the car, nowhere. And there's no way in that period of time they could have physically run to the other side of the field. And this was just one of the experiences that I've had. And we both together collectively couldn't really think of how that could have happened. And I still don't know. Some theories of what people might come up with, which might be interesting. But that particular experience was something that just couldn't be explained. And I jump in further ahead. I've seen clairvoyants who have said things that have come true. There was one particular thing that I won't go into because it's quite personal, about when I was born and what happened to me, like early years trauma, which turned out to be true. I don't know how that happened, how that sort of reached that prediction, but it did. So these things are things that I cannot prove physically, scientifically. I've not been able to debunk, and I like to try and debunk things to be able to have a philosophical view of what might have happened. So that's the reason I'm really interested in this sort of thing, because I've experienced things that I can't explain. And when I've looked at other research and other experiences from other people, like qualitative experiences, there's not been a solution for that either. So let's start with the believers. So let's start by looking at arguments for life after death. So people who would have believed this, and we're looking at ancient philosophers. And we're going to start with Plato. Good old toga-wearing Plato. He believed that the soul was eternal. So he argued that our physical bodies die, but our souls, the part of us that thinks and feels, live on in another realm. So it's like your body is a computer and your soul is the memory card. So when the computer breaks, the data still exists. And then there's like Rene Descartes, and I apologise because I always call him Descartes because that's how it's spelled, but it's really nice, Descartes. And he is the guy who says, I think, therefore I am. So he is what you would call a dualist, which means that he believed the mind or the soul and the body were separate things, so two separate entities. So when your body goes, your soul could, in theory, it could carry on into the afterlife. And more recently, there's the near-death experience camp, if you like. So more recently, people have been talking about near-death experiences, and people who have died and come back, often describing lights and tunnels or feeling peaceful. But is this proof? Maybe. It may be that you are a soul that carries on into the afterlife and goes into different places. But it may be that your brain is throwing a farewell party on the way out, because this is something that some people claims happens. So you've got arguments against. So you can see that Plato and Descartes would think about the soul and the body and the mind as being separate things. So arguments against is where you get the skeptics. So you get people like, or philosophers, ancient Greek philosophers. That's what we're looking at the moment. We're looking at traditional philosophy, such as Epicurus. And he was an ancient Greek philosopher who stated that death is nothing to us. So basically, we weren't bothered before we were born, and we won't be bothered after we die because we won't know. It's like an eternal sleep. And when we're asleep, we don't know anything, do we? We're asleep. So what is there to gain from, understanding about death, because we really don't know about it? Anyway, so let's go a bit more into more modern times where we've got Richard Dawkins. So he would suggest that consciousness is a product of the brain. So when the brain dies, because that's a physical element of our physical self, then that's the end of our story. So when the brain dies, we die, and that's it. And sorry, let me get my teeth in for this one. Philosopher Daniel Dennett suggests that we can call the soul um, as a complex collection of brain functions. So he would like sort of describe it as flicking off a switch, I suppose. So when you're flicking off a switch, everything goes out, the lights will go out. Because when our brain shuts down, when our body shuts down, there's nothing left. And he would suggest there's nothing supernatural about that, it's just biology. So, in short, there's no soul, there's no afterlife, and there's no haunting of, I don't know, Glenda who died 30 years ago. Nothing like that would exist. And if you look at this in sort of like an analysis, we don't really know because there's no concrete evidence either way of what happens how when we die. Nobody can prove what happens when we die. All we know is that we stop existing in one way or another. So the belief in afterlife is comforting in one way because if we feel that there is life after death, it helps people cope with grief and it helps people to understand that we can have some kind of meaning to any suffering that we've experienced while being alive and that we're part of something much, much bigger. And this is where religion can come onto things and spirituality can really help us to gain understanding of what might be out there. Then you look on the flip side and if you think of there being nothing after death, it might be a bit too confident. Because, after all, if we can really claim to know what happens in a place where we've never been, it's a little like having an experience of doing a review of somewhere you've never seen. So it's a bit counterproductive. So, anyway, there's some things to really think about when you're looking at life after death. And this is where I'm landing. So, I think there's a lot of stuff out there that we've not really gotten into because we haven't had the ability to get into. We can't possibly know what happens when we die apart from our bodies stop and our brain and our body stops functioning. But that doesn't give us any substance to any reason for or against the fact that our souls may or may not exist. So thinking about that in all that different matter, we haven't any conclusion really. For me, my opinion is there's just too much qualitative stuff out there of people having experiences, but there's not enough to really look at how that can be debunked or how it can be gathered into some kind of truth. So we're still up in the air. So what I'd like to think about with this is how we can discover more based on different theories. So again, we've looked at the duality side of things. So we talked about the brain, we've talked about the soul, we've talked about how bodies. There is things in there about religion as well and how religion has transpired over time to help us understand what different belief systems are in life after death. So you can look into that angle as well. I don't particularly look into the religious side of things because I am not religious in that sense, but that's my belief. If you're wanting to look into this, you might want to look into that section a lot more to see where you land in your thoughts. But again, creating arguments to really bolster any conclusion going forward. So you can look at the religious side. You can also look at psychology. So one thing I haven't looked at, and you might want to think about this and try and find some research, is the situation when I was talking about my friend, how we both experienced the same thing. Because if it was just one of us, we could sort of have a suggestion that one of us saw something that we believe was true but wasn't. When there's two, you've sort of got that added witness, that added support that there was something happening there. But one of the things that I thought may be a way of debunking this is whether there's some kind of hysteria around it. There was some kind of circumstance that enabled us to believe that that was true from two different forms. So two different people collectively showing that this is true, maybe some kind of hysteria or some kind of visual circumstance. So that's something you could really look into and get to know a little bit more about. So in the last podcast that I did, or maybe the one before, I gave a list of recommended reading of books that you could sort of look into. I would suggest maybe at this point, if you want to delve into this a little bit more or add some experiences or really have a discussion, I would look at the metaphysical side of things. I've gave some ideas of some philosophers earlier which might want to help with debunking or sort of smoothing that case a little bit more, that there is some arguments for the afterlife. And again, these philosophers are Plato, Rene Descartes, look into dualism, and maybe sort of like then looking at your Epicurus and your Richard Dawkins and your Daniel Dennett, because having these arguments side by side may help you to get a bit more of a grasp of what these ancient philosophers have been saying over time. And there's a lot more modern theories, I understand, but I do want to sort of like bottom it first and then go further forward. And if we have more debates on this subject, then we can look at more modern arguments around this and more experiences that have enabled us to think in more modern ways of and more scientifically grown ways in which we may be able to come to some more conclusions. So as we sort of conclude on this podcast, I'd like to turn these thoughts to your thoughts, so you can think about whether you feel that that there is life after death and that there is an afterlife, or whether you think it's not. And if you have come to any of these conclusions, why have you come to these conclusions? And if you say it's because there's been too many experiences and it can't not be, then maybe that's not enough to have the best argument. And that's where I'm standing with this, because I sort of think there is more, but how can I prove that? And it's a way of like grabbing any theories that you can to be able to shape that argument a little bit more than what you've got. And then you've got the other side of it, obviously debunking it. I'm going to leave that with you. And if you want to create more of this discussion and you want to send your thoughts in so I can include it in another podcast or have some discussion online, you can comment or you can email me. And my email is available on the YouTube channel. And I will hopefully hear from you soon. So that's me from today. This is a little bit about is there life after death or is there an afterlife? And we will pick this up as we go further forward. But thanks for listening, and I hope you took something from this and it gave you some philosophical thought while sipping a cup of tea or any other beverage that appeals to you. Thanks for listening, and I will speak to you soon. Take care. Bye.